Welcome to the first episode of A Witch Lives There. This is a new podcast that I'm making. I'll introduce myself. Hi, my name is Izzie Naylor. I'm a singer-songwriter, but I'm enthusiastic, obsessed with witches. The name of this podcast actually comes from when I was a child. I would sit in the back of my parents' car, my grandparents' car, and any house sort of in the distance, behind some trees. I would say, that's a witch's house, witch lives there. So made a podcast. Child me would be so pleased, I'm sure. So because this is the first episode, I'll be doing many more, talking all about witches in history, in literature, movies, etc., mythology, whatever. I thought it would be good to start this episode with a sort of old story, perhaps one of the original witches. Witches have been around for thousands of years. We see them in Greek mythology, the Bible. I mean, there are famous witch trials that we've all heard of and stories that we've all been read, but you may not have heard of this witch yet. This story is about the first recorded person to be condemned for witchcraft in Ireland and Britain. Alice Kyteler was born in 1263 in County Kilkenny, Ireland. She was the only child of wealthy Norman parents who had emigrated to Ireland in the mid-13th century. By 1280, Alice had married her first husband. His name was William Outlaw, and together they had a son who they also called William. So not to get confused, we've got William I, who's the father, the first husband, and William II, who is the son. In around 1285, though, William I became ill and died very suddenly and mysteriously. At this point, Alice was quite rich because her first husband was a moneylender and a merchant, so he was quite wealthy, and his money went to her and their child. And shortly after his death, Alice actually married her second husband, whose name was Adam. Adam was actually another wealthy moneylender. Later on, Alice and her son William from her first marriage got into business together and became moneylenders themselves and owned a few properties. And every time they would lend money, they would keep the profits for themselves. It then came about in 1302, Alice and Adam were accused of murdering her first husband. It was never proven that they killed the first husband, but the person that accused them and his accomplice had apparently stolen £3,000 from Alice and Adam, and Edward I himself helped the matter resolve in Alice and Adam's favour. And if that was £3,000 in 1302, then that would be well over £3 million in today's money. So it's safe to say that the couple was extremely wealthy. But, interestingly, Adam soon died, suddenly and mysteriously. It was believed at the time that his death was due to his heavy drinking, but right before he died, he signed over all his money, everything he'd earned, everything he owned, to Alice and her son. So now, even wealthier, Alice married her third husband, a man named Richard, who was a wealthy landowner in County Tipperary. And then the pattern continued with her third husband's early, sudden, and mysterious death. Alice then faced resentment from locals because of her wealth, but also from her stepson, who was Richard's son, named Richard. After his father's death in 1316, she took proceedings against him for her widow's dower, and the son did not believe that she was owed this. In fact, if she had not intervened, all of Richard's children would have benefited, they would have received the money, and they would have been fairly rich themselves. So this was when suspicions against Alice really started. But it was Alice's fourth husband, a man named John, who unwittingly started a series of events that would lead to Alice being charged with witchcraft. Alice married John in 1316, and some years later he began showing signs of illness. His hair and nails fell out, and he became weak and sickly. These, we now know, are symptoms of arsenic poisoning, so that's interesting. But even in his sickness, he managed to change his will to benefit Alice and her son. This resulted in even more resentment from John's family members. So these family members of the fourth husband got together with the children of the previous husbands, and together they decided that Alice must have murdered her previous husbands and was poisoning the fourth using witchcraft. They brought their complaints against her to a local bishop. These complaints twisted into satanic conspiracy, and the family claimed that Alice had bewitched her husbands and forced them to change their wills. After hearing all of this and believing it, the bishop wrote to the Chancellor of Ireland and demanded that he arrest Alice, her son William, and several of their close friends and servants. But unfortunately for the bishop, the Chancellor was actually a close relative of Alice's first husband, and she'd not been found guilty of murdering him, so they were still fairly close. So the Chancellor rejected the request, saying that the bishop was interfering with Irish affairs, which he felt the church had no business doing. So the court ruled that the state couldn't arrest Alice until the church had tried and excommunicated her, so the bishop did just that. He also charged William Outlaw, Alice's son, with heresy and called for his arrest. But again, unluckily for the bishop, William had connections in high places, and he contacted these connections and instead had the bishop arrested and imprisoned in Kilkenny jail until the date William was actually supposed to have appeared in court. On his release, the bishop was obviously fuming, so angry, nothing is going to plan for him, so he continues his campaign to condemn Alice. He is not letting that go. He demands that she appears before him, and eventually this leads to Alice and her accomplices being accused and investigated for witchcraft. Because of this, Alice returns from her excommunication, and in a show of defiance, she files a defamation of character charge against the bishop and claimed to be unlawfully excommunicated. This is where things twist, and they don't go so well for Alice now. The bishop won and was allowed to prosecute however he saw fit. Alice and her supposed accomplices had many charges brought against them. Some are pretty far-fetched. We can look at them now and think, that's insane, that can't be real. And some of them are maybe a little closer to what the truth probably was. Some of these charges were denying the power of Christ and of the church, which at the time was considered to be worship of the devil, sacrificing animals to a demon called the Son of Art, who Alice was allegedly also having a sexual relationship with. They apparently stole the keys to the church and had their coven meetings there at night and without permission. They were said to be making dark magic potions in the skull of a criminal, using disturbing ingredients such as nails from the dead, organs from chickens, worms, and clothes from unbaptized boys. And it was alleged that she'd used witchcraft and sorcery to kill and infatuate her husbands so that they would turn over their wealth to her. And they said that in that moment she was also engaged in an act of poisoning her fourth husband, who was close to death. With all these charges, Alice was held at Kilkenny Castle, joined by her servants and son, who were arrested with her. Alice, of course, denied these charges, and her wealth gave her some sort of immunity. It stopped her from being tortured and whipped in the street. But many of her alleged accomplices, unfortunately, did not have wealth on their side, so they were tortured to extract their confessions. One of these servants was a woman named Petronilla de Meath. She buckled quickly under torture, which the bishop was calling flogging, so that it all seemed a bit more above board and the confessions could be taken as real and not forced. Petronilla confessed to participating in witchcraft, and in this implicated Alice alongside her, affirming many of the accusations against her. So with this confession, it should have been easy for the bishop to condemn Alice, to get this taken forward, to have her be found guilty. But this is where there is yet another twist in our tale. The Chancellor, who still believed Alice was still on her side, did not think that she was guilty of anything somehow. He used his political power to organise Alice's escape. So during a dark evening, Alice's guards were beaten senseless, and she was released from the dungeons beneath Kilkenny Castle. It's said that Alice fled to England in that summer of 1324, but no one's heard of her. She completely disappeared from history. No one knows where she went. She managed to escape being burnt at the stake, but she was perhaps guilty of poison, I would say. Maybe definitely. So no one knows what happened to Alice, but it's not the end of the story because there were so many other people who were accused. And in fact, that husband who was being poisoned currently, that fourth husband, managed to get better when Alice went. It's a miracle. He managed to recover. I don't think he lived long after that. And I think he got himself into a little bit of trouble as well. But he wasn't poisoned, so he didn't die. Alice's son William did not escape, but he pleaded with the bishop and received a fairly light sentence. He had to attend Mass 3 times a day for a year, feed the poor, and add a new lead roof to a cathedral. So he got off pretty lightly. Many of the women who served Alice and were accused alongside of her, they managed to avoid death, but they did receive various punishments from flogging to incarceration, and afterwards they were separated so they could no longer work together and potentially do more witchy things. One of the servants, however, did not fare so well, and of course, that is Petronella, the woman who had confessed. The bishop believed that someone still had to be made an example of, so on November the 3rd, 1324, Petronella was burned at the stake in place of Alice. She was the first person in Ireland or Britain to face this punishment for the crime of heresy. So poor Petronella faced the punishment for a crime that she probably did not commit. There is a legend in Kilkenny that as Petronella was tied to the stake, she cursed the town and vowed her revenge. And honestly, I hope she got a bit of revenge, to be honest. And her spirit is actually said to be seen walking the darkened streets. So if you ever find yourself in Kilkenny, you might just see Petronella walking around and you can say hi, tell her that you're sorry, and just hope that she doesn't curse you as well. And while Alice may have been lost to history, her spirit has apparently also been seen. This is at Kyteler's Inn, which she once owned, and if you go there you can actually see a painting by an artist named Paddy Shaw, who gave this painting that he'd done of her to the inn with a note saying, "It didn't like living with me, I think she wanted to go home, so have her." So that concludes the story of the first witch. It's a really fascinating case and it plays a huge part in witch trial history. It came before any sort of real fear of witches and witch trials. We know a lot of witch trials happened in the 1600s, well into the 1800s, but this one was sort of in a time where people were just known to be witches, like maybe women dealing with medicine and herbs. But I think Alice's alleged guilt with murdering her husbands, which, I mean, the signs point towards her doing that. That probably contributed to just witchcraft. They didn't know what she was poisoning them with at the time. I do find myself wondering whether I'm happy that Alice escaped that death by being burnt at the stake and the witch trials and everything. They were terrible things to face, but Alice potentially was guilty of killing all those men and taking their money. So I'm happy she didn't, face the really terrible trials, but I also really want to know what happened to her. I hope one day someone finds some sort of evidence to say where she was. I would love to have some answers. Did she get to England? What did she do when she got here? Did she murder someone else? Did she get done for that? I don't know. While it might have been a triumph for Alice, it was a tragedy for Petronella. Whether she was an innocent woman who fell victim to the growing fear of witches, or she did have a part to play in the deaths of Alice's husband, Petronella's death set the precedent for all future trials of heresy and witchcraft. Thank you so much for listening to this first episode. I would love to hear what you thought. If you have any suggestions for future cases or trials that I cover, then please let me know. I have an email, awitchlivestherepod@gmail.com. You can let me know of any stories that you have of witches. Maybe you have one in your family, or maybe you are a witch, or like any creepy things that have happened. Please let me know. I would love to read them. I would love to speak about them on this podcast if you give me permission, of course. And I really hope that you'll join me again next week, where I'll have another story of hexes, heresy, and haunts.